As Mike Tyson walked through the gritty streets of a rough district, the air was thick with hostility. Jax Carter, the ruthless leader of the Iron Fangs, saw an opportunity to make a statement. With arrogance and hate dripping from his words, he hurled insults at Tyson, daring him to go fist to fist. But as soon as Jax threw the first punch, he realized his mistake. One brutal strike from Tyson sent him crashing to the ground. Desperate, Jax ordered his gang to attack, unleashing a battle they would never forget. Stay tuned and hit like to see how this story unfolds. Maleficent stood silhouetted against the bleeding horizon, its scarred facade sizzling in the humid air. Fear stalked the shadows, sharp as razors, feasting on the meek and leaving only broken bones and shattered spirits in its wake. As the sun's waning rays bled into the cracked pavement, the predators emerged. Their hunger for control matched that of a jaguar prowling the depths of the Amazon, its prey a wide-eyed, panting victim. The heart of the district pulsed with a name, one that echoed through the alleys like thunder, resonating with dread. Jax Carter, the venomous head of the Iron Fangs, led a brood of miscreants who thrived on terror and subjugation, with a relentless, almost lustful hunger. They weren't just run-of-the-mill thugs. No, they were the enforcers of vitriol, the vanguards of bigotry. A band of mercenaries, they worshipped discrimination with a fervor that could rival even the most devout acolytes of ancient faiths. Jax stood like a blackened pillar of granite, his towering form framed against the dying light of the day. A scar, a twisted trophy from a past conflict, cut across his face, a crimson line that spoke of countless battles fought and won. The scar across his face twisted into a permanent grimace of contempt, a mocking reminder of past victories. The ember of his cigarette flickered in the dwindling light, its hungry glow mirroring Jax's insatiable appetite for destruction. His eyes, locked on the frenzied streets, gleamed with the arrogance of a conqueror surveying a realm he had claimed as his own. Jax's voice was a rasping growl, a snarling declaration that carried the weight of his unquenchable thirst for dominion. "This city's ours, boys," he bellowed, his words striking the heart of the Iron Fangs, his disciples of violence and supremacy. "Malice ain't nobody tough enough to change that." His bravado flared like the flames dancing at the tip of his cigarette, a firestorm of ego and arrogance, scorching and unrelenting. The Iron Fangs cackled like hyenas, their laughter a savage symphony of violent bravado. Bottles clinked, and tales of cruelty were swapped like baseball cards, each story more twisted than the last. Their camaraderie was cemented in the foundation of suffering, a bond forged in torment. To the Iron Fangs, fear was the crown they wore proudly, their confidence radiating like the unyielding beams of a dying sun. A burning star, untouchable and self-assured, hung in the heavens. The night, cloaked in the sinister garb of anarchy, was about to reveal a secret that would unravel Jax Carter's reign of terror. The terror of the city, Jax led his marauding pack with the swagger of a gladiator, certain another victory awaited him in the Colosseum. But he was blind to the fate lurking just beyond the shadows. Little did he know, today's fight would be no mere bloodsport. It would be a reckoning, a day that would stain the pages of history in the crimson hue of justice and retribution. Mike Tyson, a warrior out of his element, moved through the concrete jungle with the calm of a monk on pilgrimage. Clad in the simple armor of his own humility, his fists, once instruments of brutal power in the ring, were now tucked behind him, idle, symbols of peace. As he walked, there was a quiet dignity about him, a man not seeking trouble but tranquility. His footsteps echoed through the alleys, each rhythmic thump a meditative pulse in the chaotic symphony of the city. He moved like a lion among the sheep, silent, focused, yet with an undeniable presence that commanded attention. Mike Tyson's presence commanded the attention of all who crossed his path. His poise, the regal carriage of a fighter, captured the eyes of those around him, even if they didn't immediately recognize the man who walked among them. For, as they say, a king need not announce himself. His very essence, his electrifying aura, drew curiosity and awe from the common folk. In some deep, primal part of their being, they sense the predator in their midst. Yes, for some, confidence is not just a trait. It's a challenge to be met, a mountain to be climbed, in a world where bravado often serves as the currency of power. Often mistaken for mere arrogance, confidence in a man like Tyson was a beacon, too bright for some to tolerate. Those like the Iron Fangs, men who thrived on breaking spirits, sought to twist such self-assurance into knots of self-doubt. And so, as Mike Tyson made his way through the city, their eyes were drawn to him, captivated by a presence that shone brighter than any street lamp. The sudden clang of the cigarette hitting the pavement was like a gunshot, cutting through the air and punctuating Jax's words with a sharp, menacing warning. His eyes, honed by years of conflict, locked onto Tyson from across the street, recognizing the kind of power that only lived in the rarest of men. Jax's posture shifted, his body language morphing into that of a predator sensing prey. "Look at this guy," he muttered, his voice laced with the acidic venom of unchecked ego. "Walking through our turf like he owns it." A low, menacing chuckle rose from one of the Iron Fangs, sharp and jagged, like the sound of glass shattering. "That's Mike Tyson, boss," the gang member said, the name heavy with both recognition and a grudging respect. The boxer. The mention of Tyson's profession sparked something primal in Jax, like a predator's instinct awakening at the scent of danger. His eyes narrowed, a cruel smile twisting his lips, the thought of a fellow beast in his territory. Jax's scoff was sharp and dismissive, echoing like a whip crack. "Boxing ain't fighting," he spat, the words venomous and biting. "Put that guy in a real fight, no rules, no refs, and he'd fold like everybody else." The hubris in his voice was palpable, a boiling, seething arrogance that could ignite a spark in the driest tinder. The gang laughed in a chorus of bravado, each cackle a cowardly defense against the truth, a shield against the icy grip of doubt that was slowly creeping into their hearts. For even in their bravado, they couldn't ignore the chill of uncertainty. Itself had momentarily halted. The tension in the air thickened, crackling with anticipation. Though they'd laugh, scoff, and denigrate Mike Tyson's prowess, there was an uncomfortable truth, an elephant in the room, that they refused to address. They'd all heard the stories. They'd seen the footage. And Jax Carter was no exception. He was the alpha in this pack of wolves, and to back down now would be an admission of weakness, a surrender of dominance. "Hey, Tyson!" he bellowed, his voice carrying across the street like a battle cry. At Jax's challenge, Mike Tyson paused mid-stride, his body stilled, as if time itself had momentarily halted. Itself had ground to a halt. The wind ruffled his hair, the faint sound of traffic rustling against the silence like whispers of warning. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, Mike Tyson turned his head. His gaze, like a knife's edge, found its target with lethal precision. The boldness in Jax's step was like that of a bull, each footfall crashing into the pavement, sending ripples of tension through the air. "You lost, champ," he taunted, his voice dripping with the cockiness of a schoolyard bully, his grin widening with an arrogance that could suffocate. "As ugly as a crooked alleyway. This ain't your neighborhood, hood." The silence that followed was almost palpable, thick with the weight of impending chaos, like the calm before a storm that was about to tear through the streets. Mike Tyson's silence was a chilling thing. It wasn't just quiet, it was deadly silence. The kind that echoed through the alleyways, resonating in the spaces between every heartbeat that dared to beat in that street. His dark eyes, like twin black holes, bored into Jax Carter's bravado with a palpable intensity. They didn't just stare, they devoured it. The cocky swagger, the brash words that had once filled the air, now seemed to wither under his gaze. And still, Mike said nothing. Just that silence. A statement unto itself. Nothing. Jax's smirk, as if he'd already won the battle, spread across his face like a snake's smile. His ego so bloated, it could almost touch the clouds. "What's the matter, cat got your tongue?" he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt as he glanced back at his cronies. The vicious chuckle that erupted from their throats was a twisted fanfare for their leader. Arrogance. But Jax was about to learn a hard lesson. With a nonchalance that belied the storm gathering in his eyes, Mike Tyson turned away. His back straight, his posture unwavering. There was no swagger, no posturing, just a calm that sent a chill through the air, the kind of calm that foreshadowed destruction, very air itself. The tension thickened, suffocating the space between them. Jax's fury rippled through his gang, igniting a flame in their chests. The Iron Fangs, predators who fed off fear, sensed the shift. The calm before the storm had passed, and now the storm was raging. Mike's footsteps never faltered. His body, a machine of restraint, carried on its unhurried pace as if he were walking through a dream, untouched by the frenzy rising behind him. His silence was a weapon. It gnawed at Jax, pushing him further toward the precipice of his own destruction. Jax couldn't understand it. He had cracked skulls, broken bones, controlled everything around him with violence, but this was different. He wasn't breaking Tyson. Tyson was choosing to ignore him. That refusal to engage, to even acknowledge his existence, it rattled Jax to his core. "Hey, I'm talking to you, tough guy," Jax bellowed, his voice raw with frustration. Followed, the air hanging heavy between them. His body, still poised with the calm of a man who had seen it all, finally shifted. The faintest of pauses, a momentary hesitation, before Mike's eyes, cold and unwavering, locked onto Jax with the weight of 1,000 silent storms. The world seemed to shrink, the noise of the gang's jeers fading into a muted blur until it was just him and Jax. The street itself seemed to hold its breath. Jax's taunts, like arrows aimed at Tyson's unshakable calm, were deflected with the precision of a man who had lived for nothing but conflict. He could see it now. Tyson wasn't afraid. He didn't need to prove a damn thing. This realization, however small, chipped away at Jax's arrogance, replacing it with something darker, something desperate. His voice faltered for the briefest moment, a crack in his armor, but he quickly recovered, the venom flowing back as he leaned in even closer, his words now thick with derision. "What's wrong, Mike? You scared to throw hands without gloves?" The moment stretched into infinity. Confrontation, Jax's stance grew more aggressive, the bristling bravado of a man who believed he could break any adversary with a mere gesture. His gang, sensing the shift in energy, muttered excitedly behind him, urging him on like vultures circling their prey. "This is gonna be good," one of them whispered, but it was the crackling anticipation in the air that betrayed their growing unease. Mike Tyson didn't flinch. He stood there, his broad frame unmoving, his fists still behind his back, giving no indication of aggression. But in his silence, there was a storm building, a quiet, terrifying promise of retribution. The kind of danger only those who had been in the ring with him truly understood. Jax, like a moth drawn to flame, took a step closer. His voice, dripping with the venom of arrogance, cut the stillness. "You think you can take me down, Tyson? You've got nothing left but a broken record of glory. I've seen it all before. Fighters like you come and go." His grin widened, now full of derision. "But I'm different. And you? You're just a washed-up has-been." The words hung in the air, a deliberate attempt to provoke, to tear at the fabric of Mike's reputation. But Mike's eyes never wavered. He simply took a step forward. The sound of his heavy boots on the cracked pavement was the only thing that seemed real in that moment. "Enough talk," Mike said, his voice now a low rumble. His fists clenched at his sides, muscles rippling with latent power. "Let's see who's the real fighter here." The moment snapped. Time seemed to freeze, the tension so thick it was almost unbearable. The Iron Fang's laughter faltered, uncertainty creeping in as they watched their leader inch ever closer to the storm that was about to hit dominance. The primal force of battle was beginning to seep into Mike's veins. Every muscle screamed for release, for action, for the crushing strike that had made him a legend. But here, on this cracked pavement, in this dark alleyway, it wasn't a fight for victory. It was a fight for respect. Jax, on the other hand, was drunk on his own bravado. His chest puffed out, his words spewing like venom, each insult meant to puncture Mike's composure. No gloves, no rules, Tyson. Just raw power. You think you're tough? I'll show you what happens when you step into my world. His grin twisted, a savage glee dancing in his eyes. You'll fold like the rest. Mike's response was a slow exhale. The only sign of emotion was the tightening of his jaw, a subtle shift that spoke volumes. But there was no fury in his stance, just an unwavering, steely resolve. Jax lunged forward, the moment finally snapping into motion, a blur of aggressive energy. His fist swung, a wild, untrained strike aimed for Mike's head, full of the overconfidence of a man who thought he had the upper hand. Mike moved in a fluid motion, sidestepping the punch with the grace of a predator. His reaction was almost immediate. His fist shot out like a lightning strike, landing squarely in the center of Jax's chest, knocking the wind out of him. Jax staggered back, eyes wide in disbelief, but the arrogance still burned in his gaze. You made a mistake, Mike said quietly, his voice low and full of lethal calm. The Iron Fangs had no time to react before Mike was upon Jax again. A swift right hook sent Jax crashing into the nearest wall, the sound of impact echoing through the alley. The gang members froze, unsure whether to step in or retreat. Jax, crumpled against the bricks, gasped for breath, his pride shattered with every beat of his heart. Mike stood over him, a towering figure, his chest heaving as he fought to keep the battle contained. The air hummed with the raw energy of the fight, the unspoken message clear. Respect could only be earned through strength. Jax's eyes burned with hatred, but his body betrayed him. He could barely stand. His gang watched in stunned silence, realizing, perhaps for the first time, that their leader was no longer the predator, but the prey. His body reacted without thought, without hesitation. With the precision of a surgeon, he sidestepped Jax's wild punch, his feet barely making a sound on the cracked pavement. The moment felt suspended in time, a single, sharp breath before the storm. Jax's fist continued its trajectory, meeting nothing but air, his balance thrown off by the missed strike. In that instant, Mike Tyson moved forward like a tidal wave, his movements an elegant display of controlled fury. His right hand shot out, a fist of raw power, crashing into Jax's jaw with a sickening thud. The impact was like a thunderclap, a final punctuation to the arrogant taunts that had filled the air moments before. Jax's head snapped to the side, his body jerking as if hit by a sledgehammer. For a heartbeat, there was silence, a void where sound seemed to falter. The air, thick with tension and anger, was suddenly pierced by the sickening crack of bone meeting bone. Jax stumbled back, his hands flailing as he tried to regain his footing, his face contorted in a mixture of pain and disbelief. The swagger that had once dominated his posture evaporated in an instant, replaced by something far more fragile: fear. Mike Tyson stood tall, unfazed. The single punch had delivered the message, and the weight of it hung heavy in the air. Jax was no longer the predator. He was the prey, cowering beneath the shadow of a man who had mastered his craft. You wanted no rules? Mike's voice was cold, his words cutting through the haze of confusion around them. You got it. Jax, spitting blood onto the pavement, glared up at Mike through swollen eyes, his chest heaving with both rage and the remnants of pride. The Iron Fangs remained frozen, the gang members now unsure whether to step in or retreat. Their leader, the one they had followed with unwavering loyalty, was on the ground, outmatched by a single punch. You don't scare me, Tyson, Jax grunted, wiping the blood from his lips with a trembling hand. His voice, however, betrayed him, quivering with uncertainty, no longer the arrogant, venomous tone it had been just moments ago. Mike didn't respond with words. He didn't need to. His gaze alone was enough, a silent reminder of what lay in store for anyone who dared challenge him. The alleyway, once filled with the raucous laughter and swagger of the Iron Fangs, now echoed with an ominous silence. And for the first time, Jax realized he wasn't the one in control anymore. Followed. Jax's body was lifted from the ground with the force of the punch, his feet leaving the pavement for a brief, surreal moment, as if time itself had slowed. His arms flailed, trying to find purchase in the air, but the world around him was already spinning in dizzying circles. His mind, clouded by the shock of the hit, couldn't process the brutality of what had just happened. The gang stood frozen, their earlier bravado evaporating like mist in the wake of Tyson's devastating strike. They had all seen fights, street brawls, brutal exchanges, but nothing like this. Jax Carter, their fearless leader, was now crumpled on the pavement like a rag doll, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth as he struggled to push himself up. The arrogance that had once made him seem indomitable was now shattered, and for the first time, fear was written clearly across his face. Mike Tyson took a step forward, the weight of his presence heavier than any weapon. The crowd held its breath, as though they were witnessing something greater than a mere fight. A man facing down his own reckoning. Jax groaned, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he tried to catch his breath. He looked up at Tyson, his eyes wide with both disbelief and rage. "You," he wheezed, his voice cracking. "You don't know what you've just done." Mike Tyson didn't need to say anything. His silence, the calm in his posture, spoke volumes. He was in control. The violence had been swift, calculated. There was no bravado in his actions, only the cold certainty of someone who had been to the darkest corners of the world and emerged unscathed. Jax, bloodied and broken, tried to steady himself on the ground, his hands shaking. I'll have you destroyed," he muttered, though the words had lost their sting, his confidence a distant memory. "Not today," Tyson replied, his voice low and steady. He wasn't threatening. It was simply a fact. The Iron Fangs watched in stunned silence, their loyalty to their leader now hanging by a fragile thread. Mike Tyson had just shown them that true power wasn't about how loud you could roar. It was about how swiftly you could strike. Leader with wide eyes, as if unsure whether what they had just witnessed was real. The sound of Jax's labored breathing filled the alley, a painful reminder of his vulnerability. For all the venom in his words, for all the fear he'd instilled in the city, he was now nothing more than a broken man, sprawled on the cold concrete like a discarded puppet. Mike Tyson stood above him, towering not just in physical size but in the aura of control that radiated from him. His calm was a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding around him. He didn't need to say anything. His presence alone was enough to silence the street, to keep the Iron Fangs in check. Jax's eyes, wide with shock and fury, flickered with an unspoken question. Was this it? Was he finished? A man who had built his empire on terror, now reduced to a quivering shell of himself. He tried to push himself up, his arms trembling with the effort, but every movement seemed to worsen his agony. "Get up, Jax," Mike said quietly, his voice low but firm. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't even a threat. It was a command, and for a moment the entire alleyway seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Jax to rise. But Jax only managed to raise his head, his eyes locking with Mike's in a mixture of disbelief and fury. His lips parted, attempting to form words, but the pain was too much. His arrogance had been shattered, and now all that was left was the wreckage of his ego. "I'm not done with you," Jax finally croaked, the words barely escaping his lips. But even in his defiance, there was a crack in his voice, a sign that the man who once stood tall with unshakable pride was faltering. Mike Tyson didn't respond. Instead, He simply turned and walked away, leaving Jax there in the alley with his shattered pride, surrounded by the silence of defeat. The Iron Fangs stood in stunned disbelief, unsure of what to do next. Their leader, once a symbol of power, was now nothing more than a cautionary tale. Some of them looked at each other, unsure whether to follow Tyson's lead or stay loyal to the man who had ruled them with fear. Mike's footsteps echoed in the silence as he disappeared into the shadows of the street, his figure fading from view. The world around him had shifted. The balance of power irreversibly changed. What had once seemed like Jax's territory was now nothing more than a graveyard for his arrogance. With a suddenness that seemed to defy the natural flow of time, Mike Tyson's right fist lashed out in a perfect arc, connecting with Jax Carter's jaw with a force that could have shattered concrete. The sound was like a thunderclap in the alleyway, crisp, powerful, and final. Jax's body went limp for a moment, the punch delivering an unrelenting shock to his nervous system. His head snapped back as if struck by a bolt of lightning, his eyes blanking out in an instant. His knees buckled, and this time there was no resistance, no pride left to hold him up. He crumpled to the ground in a heap of arrogance and venom now reduced to nothing more than a quivering mass of flesh. The Iron Fangs, who had been waiting for their leader's signal, stood frozen in disbelief. No one dared to move, their eyes locked on the spectacle before them. The air was thick with uncertainty. Jax, their king, was down. And Mike Tyson, the man who had once ruled the boxing ring, had brought him to his knees with the kind of ease that shattered the very foundation of the gang's power. The silence stretched long, stretching to the very marrow of the streets, until one of the Iron Fangs, a younger member whose face was still wet with the fear of initiation, whispered in the quiet, He's done, right? Mike Tyson didn't flinch, his body still as calm as an unmoving mountain, his breathing steady, his eyes as piercing as they had been in the ring. He didn't answer the question. He didn't need to. The message had already been sent. Jax lay on the ground, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths, trying and failing to gather himself. He raised a trembling hand to touch his swollen jaw, his face contorted with disbelief. The gang leader, the man who had ruled this district with cruelty and fear, now looked small, so small on the pavement, surrounded by the broken remnants of his pride. Mike Tyson turned his back to him, ready to walk away, but not before delivering one final line that cut through the tension like a blade. "You wanted to prove you were a fighter, Jax," he said over his shoulder, his voice cold but measured. "Now you've learned the hard way that not every fight's yours to win." The Iron Fangs, now utterly defeated, exchanged glances, the realization settling in that their leader's reign was over. Some of them even began to back away, unsure of what their next move should be in the wake of this unexpected defeat. With Mike's figure disappearing into the night, the once feared district felt eerily quiet, as if the entire street had exhaled a collective breath it had been holding for far too long. Enter his lungs, his chest heaving in desperate shallow bursts, his hands clutched at his abdomen as if to hold his body together, to contain the fury of the blow that had torn through him. The air seemed to thicken, compressing the space around him, suffocating him in its intensity. His eyes, wide and panicked, searched for anything to steady himself against. But there was nothing. Nothing except the cold, unforgiving concrete beneath him. A stark reminder of the power that had just dismantled him. Jax's pride, once a towering fortress, crumbled in that instant. His body, usually the instrument of fear and violence, was now a ragged, broken thing, completely at the mercy of the boxer standing above him. The realization hit harder than the punches. He was nothing, just another man, another casualty in a world that didn't bend to the whims of the arrogant. "Please," Jax gasped, the word slipping from his lips before he could stop it. It was a sound of pure desperation, the plea of a man whose ego had been shattered beyond repair. A man who had thought himself untouchable, now reduced to a trembling, gasping figure at the feet of the one person who had shown him how fragile he really was. Mike Tyson's gaze never wavered. He watched Jack struggle, but there was no pity in his eyes, no trace of emotion. Just a cold, unblinking assessment of a man who had played a dangerous game and lost. Tyson stood over him like a judge, silent and unwavering, the weight of his presence alone enough to suffocate Jax's fading will to fight back. "You thought you could control fear," Tyson said, his voice low, but carrying an authority that made the words sting. "But it's a dangerous thing to think you can own." Jax's body trembled, his hands now scraping against the ground in an attempt to push himself up, but his limbs refused to cooperate, too heavy and broken. He let out a low groan, frustration and pain mixing into one guttural sound. The Iron Fangs, still in shock, stood silent in the background, some of them already questioning whether their loyalty to Jax had been worth this downfall. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, until one of them, a younger man, whispered, barely audible, "What now?" Mike didn't look back. He didn't need to. His message had been made clear. "Now you go home," he said simply, his voice an unspoken dismissal. "Take this as a lesson. Learn from it." With that, Mike Tyson turned and walked away, his movements as effortless as they had been in the ring, each step resonating with authority. He left Jax Carter and his gang behind, stranded in the wake of their leader's downfall. As Tyson disappeared into the night, the echoes of his final words seemed to hang in the air, as heavy as the silence that followed. And in that moment, the district seemed to breathe a little easier. The reign of fear had been broken, and with it, the unshakable confidence of a man who thought he was invincible. Like the sound of a bell tolling, each syllable hitting with the weight of undeniable truth. Jax's breath caught in his throat, the words sinking deeper than any punch could ever go. His body quivered, still caught in the aftershocks of the blows that had shattered both his physical form and the fortress of pride he had so carefully constructed. Mike Tyson's grip tightened, just enough to remind him who was in control. There was no anger in his touch, no gloating, just an unspoken understanding. Mike wasn't here to destroy Jax, to humiliate him beyond repair. No, he was simply offering a lesson, harsh as it may be. "You'll never be what you think you are," Tyson continued, his words like a cool, cutting wind. "And you'll never be free until you accept that." Jax's head hung low, unable to lift it, as if the weight of those words had shackled him in place. His mouth opened to speak, to argue, but the words didn't come. His voice, once so loud, now seemed lost in the cavern of his chest, crushed by the crushing truth that Tyson had thrown at him. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of their breathing, a steady, rhythmic counterpoint to the chaotic beating of Jax's heart. Then, slowly, Tyson released his grip, letting Jax drop back to the unforgiving concrete with a soft thud. Jax remained on his knees, defeated, his face a mask of pain, confusion, and shame. He had thought himself untouchable. Now, everything he'd built, his reputation, his gang, his fearsome image, felt like it had crumbled to dust in his hands. "You want to run this district?" Tyson asked, his voice low, almost a murmur. "You don't even know how to live in it." Jax remained silent, too broken to respond, the heavy weight of Tyson's words hanging in the air like smoke. The gang, their faces a mix of fear and awe, looked to their fallen leader, unsure of what to do next. For the first time, the Iron Fangs weren't laughing. There was no bravado, no swagger. There was only the oppressive silence, punctuated only by the distant hum of the city beyond them. As Mike Tyson turned to leave, his steps once again measured and calm, the air seemed to shift. The district, so long under the sway of Jax's reign of terror, felt quieter, somehow, as if the world had paused to take a breath. Tyson didn't need to say another word. His presence alone had broken the cycle of violence, not with the force of fists, but with the weight of truth. The Iron Fangs watched him go, and as Jax Carter slowly pulled himself up from the pavement, his eyes still locked on the figure of Mike Tyson walking away, something inside him began to change. A seed of doubt had been planted, and for the first time, he was unsure if his way, the only way he had ever known, was really the answer. Desperation, barely a whisper, escaped his lips as he lay on the cold concrete. "You!" he gasped, but the words couldn't form, trapped in a haze of pain and confusion. His body trembled, an involuntary spasm, and yet, even as his world seemed to blur into nothingness, his pride fought to cling to life, refusing to let go. The Iron Fangs stood frozen, their expressions a mix of shock and disbelief. They'd seen their leader as invincible, feared by all. But now, their eyes betrayed a creeping sense of doubt. The once unshakable confidence of Jax Carter, the terror that had defined him, was shattered in an instant. Mike Tyson, unfazed, stood above him, his chest rising and falling steadily, like a mountain unmoved by the storm around it. He didn't revel in the moment. He didn't mock or belittle. His face was unreadable, his gaze steady, locked onto Jax's broken form with an almost detached calm. It was clear this had been no challenge to him, no victory to savor. He had merely done what was necessary, what Jax had forced him to do. "You're out of your league," Tyson spoke, his voice calm but carrying the weight of a man who had seen and conquered his demons. "This is the real world, not some playground for your petty games." He didn't wait for Jax to respond. There was nothing left to say. Jax's eyes fluttered, but his lips quivered as though trying to summon some response, some defiant word, but it never came. The truth had hit him harder than any punch, and for the first time, the fortress of arrogance he had spent years building around himself began to crack. Tyson turned his back, walking away without another glance. The sound of his footsteps, steady and resolute, seemed to echo in the silence that followed. The gang members, now uncertain of their own place in this world, exchanged uneasy glances. Their leader, their champion, the embodiment of fear, was now lying defeated at their feet. The streets, once a battleground ruled by Jax's iron grip, now felt different. The power had shifted. Jax's breath hitched again as he tried to rise, his hands trembling against the pavement, but the pain was too much, his body refusing to cooperate. His head hung low, and a bitter realization began to seep in. A quiet, painful acceptance that, in that moment, he was no longer the king of this world. He was just another fallen soul, broken by his own hubris. The Iron Fangs stood there in silence, the weight of the moment crushing them. What was left now? Who would lead them? Could they even follow Jax anymore after seeing him fall so completely? The district seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something, anything to break the stillness. But nothing came. Mike Tyson had spoken, and the silence that followed was more deafening than any fight could ever be. Air crackled with the electric tension of impending violence, the scent of blood and fury thick in the narrow alley. The Iron Fangs moved as one, a blur of motion driven by a primal need to avenge their fallen leader. Jax's roar still echoed in their ears, a call to arms, a command to restore the honor that had been stripped from them. Their feet pounded against the pavement like a drumbeat to war, their bodies propelled by blind rage and the desperate hope that they could still reclaim their status, their power, their pride. Mike Tyson, standing alone, was a mountain in the storm, his stance wide, grounded in the certainty that no amount of fury could break him. His eyes scanned the advancing pack, a calm stillness in his gaze, as though this moment were little more than a part of the grander fight that had shaped his life. His fists clenched, ready, but not with the urgency of a man outmatched. His movements, like the calm before the storm, remained deliberate and poised. "Come on." Mike's voice broke through the tension, low and unwavering. "You want some of this?" His words were a taunt, but not one born of arrogance. He knew what was coming, knew the storm the Iron Fangs would bring. But he wasn't concerned. In fact, he was almost resigned to the idea that this was inevitable, a continuation of a war that had been fought countless times in different arenas, against different opponents. The first of the Iron Fangs lunged forward, A makeshift weapon, a broken bottle, gripped in his hand, its jagged edge gleaming in the dim light. His breath was heavy, his heart racing with the adrenaline that surged through his veins. But as he closed the distance, his confidence faltered. In the split second before he struck, Tyson's fist exploded into his face, a blur of raw power and precision. The bottle dropped from his hand as he crumpled to the ground, blood splattering against the concrete. Two more charged in tandem, fists raised, fury in their eyes. One swung first, aiming for Tyson's head, but Tyson's instincts moved faster. With a swift sidestep, he dodged the punch, his body moving like a flash of lightning, and before the thug could react, Tyson's knee collided with his abdomen with a sickening crunch. The man gasped for air, his body collapsing in on itself as the wind was knocked from his lungs. The third man, armed with a chain, lashed out with a growl, the steel links cutting through the air like a whip. But Tyson, ever the seasoned fighter, moved with practiced grace, ducking under the strike and delivering an uppercut that sent the chain wielder sprawling backward, his body crashing into the brick wall behind him with a loud thud. The Iron Fangs were relentless, but their attacks were disorganized, fueled by rage and desperation. Tyson, however, moved with the fluidity of a man who had seen countless battles, his movements honed to perfection. Each blow he landed was devastating, precise, and unrelenting. He wasn't fighting with fury, but with an almost cold efficiency, neutralizing each threat before it had a chance to truly materialize. Jax, still kneeling, watched with wide eyes as his gang was torn apart, one by one. The sight of his own men falling before Tyson's brutal onslaught was a slow, agonizing realization. His reign, his empire, was crumbling before him. His chest heaved as his frustration and rage boiled over, but there was nothing he could do. He was powerless. The last of the Iron Fangs hesitated. Their attacks were faltering now, the fire of their vengeance extinguished by the stark reality of the situation. Mike Tyson stood amidst them, his body still, his breath steady, as if this was just another day in the ring, another challenge to overcome. The gang members, once so sure of their strength, now looked at each other with doubt in their eyes. Mike Tyson's gaze locked onto them, and with a final, almost disinterested glance, he spoke again. "It's over." The words, simple yet final, hung in the air like a death knell, echoing through the alleyway, marking the end of the Iron Fang's reign in the district. Jax's world, built on fear and violence, was crumbling to dust at his feet. By the sudden brutality of Mike's response, hesitated, their eyes wide with disbelief as the first attacker fell, his body lying motionless like discarded trash. The air thickened with the stench of fear, their confidence wavering as they realized just how outmatched they were. The once unified pack of wolves now scattered like frightened animals, each man looking for an escape from the inevitable. But the pack was relentless, driven by rage and the primal instinct to defend their wounded pride. Another lunged, this time with a crowbar, swinging it in a wide arc aimed at Mike's ribs. But Tyson, with the fluidity of a predator, dipped low, letting the bar whistle past him like a gust of wind. His right hook exploded into the man's side, the force of the punch driving the air from his lungs with a wet gasp. The thug staggered backward, a look of shock and pain crossing his face before he crumpled to the ground, his crowbar slipping from his limp hand. Two more came at once, fists raised, but Mike's reflexes were too fast. He ducked under one swing, and as the other moved in, Tyson's elbow shot out with brutal precision, catching the man square in the throat. The thug choked, his face contorting in agony as his knees buckled, and he collapsed in a heap, gasping for air he couldn't seem to draw in. Jax Carter, still struggling to regain some semblance of control, watched his men fall one by one. His pride shattered with each body that hit the ground. The reality of the situation was sinking in. His gang's once unshakable confidence now reduced to desperation and panic. "Get up!" Jax roared, his voice a mixture of rage and disbelief. But his men, now broken and bruised, could barely move, let alone muster the strength to fight. The Iron Fangs, once a force of terror in the district, had become nothing more than shadows of their former selves, outclassed and outmatched by a single man. Mike Tyson stood tall amid the carnage, his breathing steady, his body a pillar of calm amidst the chaos. He wasn't just fighting, he was dismantling the very foundation of Jax's empire, piece by piece. His movements were precise, a mixture of experience, power, and poise, as if this fight was just another sparring session in the ring. Jax, his face a twisted mask of fury, stepped forward, ignoring the crumpled bodies of his men, his hands balled into fists as he made one final desperate charge at Mike. His rage was now all-consuming, his mind clouded by the unbearable humiliation he was experiencing. "You think you can just walk in here and destroy everything?" Jax snarled, his voice raw with venom. His charge was fueled by nothing more than sheer pride and the need to prove that he could stand toe-to-toe with the man who had already taken everything from him. But Tyson, ever the strategist, let Jax come to him. He didn't have to chase the fight. He let it come to him with a cold, calculating precision. As Jax swung wildly, Tyson sidestepped with ease, his body fluid and effortless in its grace. The punch Jax threw missed, and in the same motion, Tyson stepped in, landing a perfect jab to Jax's midsection. The blow landed with a sickening thud, the air rushing from Jax's lungs as if he had been struck by a truck. His body froze in place for a moment, suspended in time, and then he staggered backward, his legs weak, his breath ragged. For a moment, Jax looked up at Tyson, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and rage. His pride was completely shattered, his empire lying in ruins at his feet. But even then, his resolve never fully broke. He was a man who had built his world on violence, and even now, with his body aching, with his gang defeated, he refused to accept defeat. His pride would never allow him to. Tyson didn't flinch, didn't waver. He simply stood there, waiting for the next move, his eyes steady, unwavering. His next words, soft and clear, seemed to cut through the air like a blade. "You're out of your league," Tyson said, the weight of his words carrying the finality of a sentence passed by a judge. Agony as the impact reverberated through his body, his bones cracking under the immense pressure. The street seemed to tremble beneath the brutal collision, a sharp, sickening sound of his body meeting the pavement echoing through the alley. The thug lay motionless, his chest heaving with the effort to draw in air that seemed to slip away like sand through his fingers. The remaining Iron Fangs hesitated, their resolve cracking, fear creeping into their once confident postures as they witnessed their comrade's lifeless form sprawled in the dust. But Jax, still fueled by a mixture of pride and rage, bellowed, "Keep going! Don't let him intimidate you!" His voice trembled with the strain of trying to maintain control, but the venom in his words carried the authority of a man who couldn't afford to show weakness. Yet the Iron Fangs, now questioning their own chances, shifted uneasily, their earlier confidence eroding. The third man, a hulking figure built like a tank, lifted a large chain from the ground, the metal clinking ominously in the silence. His eyes glinted with a mix of determination and panic as he charged forward, the chain swirling in the air, aiming for Tyson's head. But Mike Tyson was no stranger to violence, no novice in the art of battle. He moved like a shadow, sidestepping the chain's arc with a fluidity that seemed almost inhuman. The thug's momentum carried him forward, his body toppling into the concrete as Tyson spun, his fist shooting out with the precision of a predator. It landed square on the thug's temple, the blow crashing like a thunderclap. The thug collapsed instantly, his body folding like a rag doll, the chain slipping from his limp grip. Jax's face twisted into a grimace, his fury intensifying. But it was clear, his forces were falling apart. With each man who fell, his grip on the situation loosened. The final Iron Fang, a wiry figure with eyes wide as saucers, glanced between Jax and Tyson, his breath quickening. The sight of his comrades incapacitated, the terrifying power of Tyson on full display, made it clear. This was no longer a fight. It was a slaughter. Jax's jaw clenched, the last vestiges of his control slipping away. His voice came out in a strained, almost pleading hiss. "This is our turf, Tyson. You can't just walk in and—" "You're already beaten," Tyson interrupted, his voice low, yet carrying the weight of certainty. His gaze locked onto Jack's with an unwavering coldness, each word from his mouth landing with the weight of a final sentence. The very air seemed to freeze in the moment, and the remaining Iron Fang gang member took an instinctive step back, fear overtaking the anger that had once driven him. The alley was now filled with a palpable silence, broken only by the gasps of the fallen men and the distant hum of the city beyond. Tyson stood tall amidst the wreckage, every movement measured, every breath calm, as the reality of his dominance settled in. The gang, once fierce, now seemed like children playing at violence. And Mike Tyson? He was the storm that swept them all away. With sickening precision, each strike landing with a brutal force that left the Iron Fangs gasping for air and grasping at their broken bodies. The first thug fell like a tree felled in a storm, his head snapping back violently as his body crumpled to the pavement, unconscious before he hit the ground. The second was no better, his ribs shattered with a single thunderous punch that sent him tumbling backward, unable to even scream as the pain overwhelmed him. Tyson was a blur, an unstoppable force, moving between his attackers with an eerie calmness that contrasted the ferocity of the blows he delivered. The remaining Iron Fangs, now completely outclassed, had begun to hesitate, their bloodshot eyes wide with disbelief. What had started as a bold attack now felt like a desperate, futile attempt to combat a force of nature. Jax, still reeling from the earlier devastation, stood frozen in the middle of the chaos, his body shaking with the tremors of his unspoken fury and disbelief. His gang was being torn apart in front of him, and the one person who had dared to challenge him was taking them down with terrifying efficiency. The silence between Tyson's strikes felt heavier than the violence itself, the sound of each hit, whether a punch, a rib breaking, or a jaw snapping, echoing like a drumbeat of finality. One of the Iron Fangs, barely able to lift his hand to block, managed to get in a wild swing, but Tyson was already gone, slipping past him like smoke, his fist finding the man's temple in the next heartbeat. The thug crumpled, his face struck with such power that it turned his body at an unnatural angle, his arms flopping uselessly at his sides. Jax's vision blurred. His hands trembled, the control he'd once held slipping through his fingers like sand. He opened his mouth to shout, but no words came. All that was left was the stench of sweat and blood in the air, the relentless sound of fists meeting flesh, and the knowledge that his power, his gang, his entire world was crumbling beneath him. He finally managed to speak, his voice a whisper of rage barely audible. "Enough! Enough!" But Mike Tyson's eyes, unwavering, locked onto him as if hearing the plea was unnecessary. The fight was over. His body moved forward with the precision of a predator cornering its prey, but the gang was no longer a threat. They were simply broken, scattered in a bloody haze across the alleyway. Wheezing of the Iron Fangs, each breath a labored rasp that filled the air with a suffocating heaviness. The alley was littered with their crumpled forms, twisted and defeated, a grotesque testament to the savage efficiency of Tyson's assault. His fists, still clenched, slowly lowered to his sides, the weight of his actions settling like a dark cloud over the silence. There was no triumphant roar, no boastful exclamation, just the quiet aftermath of a storm, the air thick with the remnants of violence. Jax, standing at the edge of this broken tableau, looked on in stunned disbelief, his mouth agape as the enormity of his failure bore down on him. His gang, the fearsome Iron Fangs, lay in ruins, their strength shattered, their spirits crushed under the weight of Tyson's indomitable will. His eyes flickered from one battered body to the next, and his breath caught in his chest, the reality of his own weakness settling deep in his gut. His reign, his arrogance, his thirst for power, all reduced to dust in the wake of a man who had faced his fury without flinching. Mike Tyson didn't move for a moment. His eyes scanned the fallen men, his expression cold and unreadable. Then, with slow deliberation, he turned toward Jax, his gaze locking onto the man who had once been a king among rats but now seemed so small, so insignificant. Jax's lips parted, but no words came. His pride, once so fierce, seemed to crumble away like the broken bodies of his gang. What could he say? What defense could he offer against the raw truth standing before him? He wasn't just beaten, he was humiliated, reduced to nothing in the blink of an eye. Mike Tyson took a step forward, the sound of his boots on the pavement sharp in the silence. His presence was undeniable, his power radiating with every movement, every breath. He didn't need to say a word. The weight of his actions, the complete and utter annihilation of Jax's gang, spoke for itself. Jax looked up at him, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. You think you've won?" His voice cracked, the defiance in it a pale shadow of its former self. "You think you've beaten me?" Tyson's eyes narrowed, his tone measured, almost pitying. "No, Jax, I didn't beat you. You beat yourself." The finality in his words hung in the air, a declaration of truth too painful to ignore. Jax's shoulders slumped, the last vestiges of his arrogance crumbling beneath the weight of his own pride. Mike Tyson turned away, his back to the broken gang leader. He didn't need to watch them anymore. They were already forgotten, nothing more than a footnote in his path. As he walked away, his footsteps steady and unfaltering, the alley remained silent, save for the quiet, desperate gasps of the men who had once thought they were untouchable. And Jax Carter, leader of the Iron Fangs, stood alone among the wreckage of his empire, the realization of his own fragility settling in like a cold, crushing weight. Carter's body crawled across the cold, unforgiving concrete, his limbs shaking with desperation. The once fearsome leader of the Iron Fangs now resembled a cornered animal, his pride shattered and his spirit broken. His chest heaved as he gasped for breath, each movement slow and painful, as if his body couldn't keep up with the collapse of his world. His eyes, wide and glassy, flickered between the fallen members of his gang and the towering figure of Mike Tyson, who stood like a statue, unmoved and unyielding. No way," Jax mumbled again, his voice a trembling whisper, barely audible over the sound of his own ragged breaths. He couldn't believe it, couldn't comprehend how he had gone from being the king of the streets to nothing more than a ragged heap of flesh, begging for mercy from the man who had reduced him to this state. The once sharp edges of his arrogance, the venom that had dripped from his every word, were now replaced by the hollow echo of fear. His face, twisted in disbelief, was the last remnant of a man who had once controlled everything, who had once been feared, revered, even worshipped by his followers. Now his eyes were wide with terror, a pitiful plea for mercy in them. Tyson stood over him, his posture steady, unshaken. His expression was as cold as steel, the remnants of his earlier restraint still visible in the controlled stillness of his movements. He looked down at Jax without a hint of pity, his eyes narrowing with a quiet understanding, an acknowledgement that there was nothing more to be gained from this broken man. Jax's body trembled violently now, the fight draining from him like sand slipping through an hourglass. His fingers clawed at the ground, trying to push himself further away, seeking escape. But it was futile. His empire was gone. His men were scattered, broken, or unconscious. The streets, which had once bowed to him, now stood silent in the face of his downfall. I'll make it right," Jax whimpered, his voice barely above a whisper, but the words felt hollow even to him. There was no coming back from this, no repairing the damage, no rewriting the story. He had overestimated himself, and now he was paying the price, his pride crushed beneath the weight of his own failure. Mike Tyson's voice broke the silence, low and steady. "You don't get to make it right, Jax. You never had control. You just thought you did." Jax's eyes darted up, desperation in them. Please, I didn't." But Tyson's words cut through the air like a blade, his tone final, merciless. You don't get to plead. You get to learn. There was no malice in his voice, just a truth that stung harder than any punch he had thrown. Jax had lost, and there was no redemption waiting for him on the other side. Jax, in his desperation, looked at the faces of his fallen gang members, their vacant eyes staring back at him with a chilling emptiness. He had led them all to this. He had promised them power, respect, and a future. But all he had delivered was ruin. He dropped his head, his body finally sinking back to the ground, defeated. His hands, trembling violently, pressed against his chest, but there was no escape from the crushing weight of his failure. Tyson turned, his back now to Jax and his broken empire. The street was silent, save for the occasional sound of the wind brushing through the alleyway, as if the world itself was holding its breath in the aftermath of the storm. Mike Tyson's footsteps echoed in the distance, his figure growing smaller as he walked away from the wreckage of a man who had thought himself untouchable. Jax's eyes flickered once more toward the horizon, toward the city he had once ruled, now a place of shadows and whispers. There was no going back for him. His empire was dust, and his pride shattered beyond repair. Jax's chest heaved in shallow, panicked breaths as he was yanked into the light. The fading sunlight caught the sweat on his forehead, making his face look pale, like a ghost caught between worlds. His body trembled, and his mind raced, but all he could focus on was the grip of Mike Tyson's hand around his collar, the unforgiving force of a man who had brought destruction with nothing but his fists. "You think you can walk away from this?" Tyson growled, his grip tightening. The fury in his eyes blazed like wildfire, his words searing into Jax's soul with a righteous anger. "You think, because you hurt people, because you make them cower, that you're something special. You're just a bully who got too big for his britches." Jax's lips quivered, his pride crumbling with each passing second. His eyes flickered to the bodies of his gang, broken, twisted, their bodies littering the ground like discarded rag dolls. The once feared iron fangs were now nothing but a pile of bruised and battered shells, their once unshakable confidence shattered. Their weak groans filled the silence, a grim reminder of how quickly the tide could turn when faced with true power. "I didn't," Jax stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of his failure. His gaze shot back to Mike Tyson's face, searching for some sign of mercy, some shred of compassion. But all he found was cold steel. Tyson's grip lifted Jax off his feet, dragging him into a half-standing position as if he were nothing more than a child being scolded. The disparity between the two men couldn't have been clearer. One, a monstrous force who controlled the world around him with pure brutality. The other, a broken shell of a man who had once thought himself indestructible. "You didn't mean to?" Tyson's voice was a low growl, dripping with disdain. "You think that's gonna save you? You hurt people for fun, Jax. You took their lives, their dignity, their futures. And for what? So you could walk around like some goddamn king?" He slammed Jax back into the pavement, his body colliding with the hard ground like a rag doll tossed aside. Jax gasped, pain blooming through his chest as the wind was knocked out of him. He coughed, sputtering, unable to speak through the panic and fear that were clawing at his throat. Mike Tyson loomed over him, his face expressionless, but his eyes burned with something far deeper, something far more powerful than anger. It was righteous fury, tempered with the wisdom of a man who had fought for everything and who had seen the kind of evil that could consume a city. He wasn't just punishing Jax, he was sending a message. "You're nothing but a coward, Jax, and cowards like you don't get to run the streets anymore," Tyson said, his voice ice-cold as he stared down at the broken man in front of him. Jax's mind raced, the walls of his arrogance and defiance crumbling faster than he could rebuild them. The weight of Tyson's words hit harder than any punch ever could. He had spent so long pretending to be invincible, pretending that his cruelty was a form of power. Now, it was all laid bare before him, exposed, ugly, and irrevocable. He tried to move, to crawl, to get away, but his body refused to cooperate. His limbs felt like lead, his head spinning, and all he could do was stare up at Tyson, his fear palpable, his pride gone. "Please," Jax gasped, his voice barely a whisper. Don't finish it." But Tyson wasn't listening. His eyes remained cold and unwavering. The message had been delivered. There would be no mercy for men like Jax Carter, no second chances for those who built their empire on fear and bloodshed. The silence in the alley was deafening now, broken only by the distant sound of the city continuing to move on, unaware of the reckoning that had just taken place. That had driven him to this moment seemed to dissipate like a passing storm, leaving only a quiet fury in its wake. Mike Tyson's fist hung in the air, trembling ever so slightly, before he slowly withdrew it. His jaw clenched, but there was no more anger, no more desire to destroy. The storm inside him had subsided, replaced by a sense of finality, something much colder and more terrifying than rage. "You think this is about mercy?" Tyson's voice, low and deadly, rumbled through the silence, his eyes never leaving Jax. "This ain't mercy. This is letting you live with the consequences of your actions. You want to keep breathing? Then you remember this moment for the rest of your miserable life." Jax's heart thundered in his chest, and he could feel the sweat, cold and sticky, creeping down his back. His mind was a blur, thoughts scattered like leaves in a hurricane. The desperation was still there, clawing at him, urging him to beg for more, for anything, just to escape the hellfire that Tyson had unleashed. Jax's lip quivered, his voice breaking as he whispered, "Please, please. I'm sorry. I didn't know. But Mike Tyson didn't answer. He stood over him, watching him, as if waiting for Jax to truly understand the weight of what had just happened. The words echoed in the air, a cruel reminder of the destruction Jax had wrought in his pursuit of power. "You'll know now," Tyson finally said, his voice eerily calm. "You'll know what happens when you cross the line, and you'll know what it costs when you hurt people like this." With that, Tyson stepped back, releasing Jax from his grasp, and turned his back on him. The world seemed to slow around Jax as he collapsed to the ground, the weight of his failure crushing him. His body felt like it was made of lead, and all he could do was stare at the remnants of his gang, scattered like broken toys, their lives shattered by the man who stood before him. Jax's breath came in ragged gasps, his mind unable to comprehend the mercy or the cruelty of the situation. Mike Tyson wasn't just a boxer, a fighter. He was an embodiment of something far more terrifying. The reckoning of a man who had seen too much, felt too much, and carried the weight of every battle, every defeat, and every victory within him. "Get out of here," Tyson's words cut through the silence, harsh and unforgiving. "And don't ever show your face again." Jax didn't hesitate. He scrambled to his feet, his legs weak, his body trembling. His pride, the thing that had once made him dangerous, was now nothing more than a distant memory. He turned, stumbling away, leaving the alley and the wreckage of his empire behind. Mike Tyson stood still, watching as the last remnants of the Iron Fang slunk away into the night, their spirit broken, their arrogance shattered. As the echoes of their retreat faded, Tyson's gaze softened just slightly, the brutal predator within him receding into the shadows. For the first time in a long while, he felt the quiet satisfaction of justice served, not by a ring, not by the law, but by the raw, unfiltered power of survival. And he walked away, the weight of the alley's final moments hanging in the air, the city continuing to pulse around him, unaware of the battle that had just been fought, and won. Trembled in Mike Tyson's grip, his body slack with the realization that his power had never truly been his. It had always been borrowed from fear, from cruelty, from the false sense of control he'd clung to for so long. And now, it was crumbling, dissolving like sand between his fingers. The weight of his failure pressed down on him, a suffocating force, and he could barely breathe under the crushing pressure of the truth Mike had spoken. "You think you're a king," Tyson's voice continued, low and deliberate. "But kings don't rule with fear. They rule with respect. Respect's earned, not stolen through violence and terror." Jax's eyes fluttered as if trying to resist the truth sinking into him, but there was no escape. Tyson's words were like chains, wrapping around his soul, binding him to the reality of his downfall. The arrogance, the pride, all the things that had made him feel untouchable were now exposed for what they truly were. Fragile, hollow, and temporary. "You were never untouchable," Tyson continued, his grip tightening just enough to remind Jax of the power that still lingered beneath Tyson's calm exterior. "Not then, not now. And if you ever think you can come back from this, you're wrong. You're finished." Jax's chest heaved as he gasped for breath, his throat closing, a sense of helplessness washing over him in waves. The desperation he'd felt earlier, the need to escape, to beg for mercy, was now replaced by something far worse. The cold, bitter taste of his own failure. The weight of everything he had built, only for it to be crushed so effortlessly in a single crushing moment, made his knees weak. Tyson didn't move. He stood firm, his presence an unyielding force that commanded every ounce of attention. "You've hurt enough people, Jax," he said quietly, "and it's time someone showed you the price of that. Your reign ends here. You won't find power again the way you had it, because fear doesn't last. It burns out." Jax's mouth opened as if to speak, to beg for a second chance, but the words wouldn't come. There was no argument left, no defense. There was only the crushing weight of his own decisions, the brutal reality that Tyson had already stripped him of his illusion of power. Tyson finally released him, letting Jax crumple to the ground, a broken shell of the man he once was. Without a word, Tyson turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the still night air. He didn't need to look back. The message had already been delivered. Jax remained on the ground, staring into the dark abyss of the alleyway, his mind a storm of regret and self-loathing. He had once believed he was a predator, feared and respected. But now, he was just a man, broken and discarded, left to pick up the pieces of a life that would never be the same. The power he had once wielded so ruthlessly had slipped through his fingers, and now all that was left was the bitter taste of defeat. And as Mike Tyson's figure disappeared into the distance, Jax realized, too late, that fear had never been the true path to power. Respect, dignity, and the ability to stand without breaking, that was the true strength he had never known. And it was gone now, forever. Turned and walked away, his back a silhouette against the dimming sky, leaving Jax Carter to wallow in the wreckage of his own making. The streets, once an extension of his dominion, now felt alien, distant, as if the very air had shifted in the wake of Tyson's retribution. Each step Mike took away from him was a reminder of how fragile Jax's empire had been, how easily it crumbled under the weight of a single, undeniable truth. Jax remained on the ground, his body aching, but it was the sting of failure, the crushing realization that he had been nothing but a bully with a broken sword, that burned the deepest. His eyes, once filled with arrogance, now stared at the cold concrete, the space between him and the world widening with every breath he took. His chest heaved with shame, a grotesque kind of pride that had driven him to this point now turned to dust. The night seemed to close in around him, the city's hum becoming a distant murmur, as if the world had moved on without him. And it had. There was no place for him here anymore. The power he had once wielded, built on fear and manipulation, had evaporated in the span of moments. "Fear," Jax mumbled to himself, his voice cracking as he finally spoke, breaking the suffocating silence. That's all it ever was. He swallowed hard, the taste of his own defeat bitter in his mouth. He had thought fear was his weapon, but now it felt more like a cage he had built for himself, a cage he could no longer escape from. The last remnants of the iron fangs lay scattered across the pavement, some unconscious, others too scared to move, each one a silent witness to their leader's fall. There would be no more bravado, no more threats, only the cold reality that Mike Tyson had ended not just a fight, but an entire reign built on violence and cruelty. Jax's hand trembled as he reached up, wiping away the blood from his lips, but it was his pride he couldn't seem to erase. His kingdom was gone, and in its place was a painful clarity he would never forget. His breath was shaky, his body exhausted, but his mind was alert, replaying the moments that led him here. The arrogance, the belief that he was untouchable, the disregard for the lives of others. Now, in the wake of his defeat, it was clear. Tyson hadn't just destroyed his body, he had shattered the very foundation of everything Jax had believed in. And for the first time, Jax Carter understood what true strength really was. It wasn't in his fists. It wasn't in the fear he instilled in others. It was in restraint, in knowing when to walk away, and in the silent power of choosing not to break, even when the world crumbles around you. Jax stayed there, broken, for what felt like an eternity, before the faint sound of sirens began to echo in the distance. A reminder that even after the chaos, the law would come to sweep up the remnants, to restore order. But for Jax Carter, there would be no returning from this. The streets had already spoken, and his kingdom was no more. The lion, only to be crushed beneath the weight of his own pride. As Mike Tyson's figure disappeared into the shadows of the night, Jax Carter's gaze remained fixed on the pavement, his body frozen in place as the reality of his failure settled like lead in his chest. The echoes of Tyson's footsteps faded, but the reverberations of that one blow, the one that had shattered not only his body but his entire existence, remained. The once unshakable swagger that had defined Jax's every step was gone, replaced by a hollow, aching realization of his own vulnerability. The world seemed quieter now. The frantic energy of the street, the chaos of the fight, had all been swallowed up by the weight of defeat. His gang, once a formidable force of fear and violence, was now reduced to a scattered group of broken bodies and shattered egos, their once unshakable loyalty crumbling in the face of their own leader's downfall. Jax's eyes flicked to each of them, their faces twisted with pain, shock, and confusion. He could feel the weight of their disappointment bearing down on him, and it stung more than any physical injury. They had followed him, believed in him. But now, they were lost. And so was he. Jax tried to push himself up, but his muscles protested, and he crumpled back to the ground, exhausted by the weight of his own failure. The world felt heavy now. His empire had been built on the fragile foundation of fear, and it had all come crashing down in an instant. The roar of the sirens grew louder, signaling the end of this chapter. The law was coming, but Jax knew that no amount of justice would undo what had been done. His reign was over, and it had ended not with a bang, but with the quiet finality of his own undoing. The silence of the alley stretched on, thick and suffocating, as Jax remained on the ground. Mike Tyson's words, "You're not built for this," echoed in his mind, and with each passing moment they grew louder, more insistent, as if they were being branded into his soul. Jax Carter had tried to break a man who had already broken himself, a man who had seen the worst of the world and walked away without losing his humanity. Tyson had shown him what true strength was, not in dominance, not in cruelty, but in restraint, in the ability to walk away when every instinct screamed to destroy. Jax's eyes, once filled with arrogance and entitlement, now reflected nothing but the cold clarity of defeat. The night had claimed him, just as it had claimed his empire. The only thing left now was the hollow echo of his own choices, ringing in the quiet alley like the last remnants of a storm that had already passed. As the sirens approached, Jax lay still, the weight of the night pressing down on him. The lessons learned, too late, would haunt him for the rest of his life. And as the world moved on around him, Jax Carter, once the king of the streets, had been reduced to nothing more than a lesson, a warning. The consequences of arrogance had come for him, and they were unforgiving. As the flashing lights of the approaching police vehicles illuminated the alleyway, Jax Carter remained motionless, his body broken, his pride shattered beyond repair. The faint hum of the sirens was like the soft tolling of a bell, signaling the end of his reign. His mind, still foggy from the pain and humiliation, kept replaying the moment he had thought himself invincible. The crushing blow that had sent him to the ground, the cold indifference in Mike Tyson's eyes, the way he had been so easily defeated, all of it clawed at him from the inside, twisting like a knot in his chest. He had walked into this fight with the arrogance of a man who believed his strength was the measure of his worth, who thought his cruelty made him untouchable. But now, there he was, sprawled on the cold concrete, a broken husk of the monster he had once been. The loud, brash leader of the Iron Fangs was gone, replaced by something smaller, something terrified. The echoes of Tyson's words, "You're not built for this," haunted him, replaying over and over in his mind like a mantra. They weren't just words. They were a verdict, a sentence, not just on his physical abilities but on his very identity. Mike Tyson had dismantled him not only with his fists, but with the undeniable truth of his existence. Strength didn't come from dominance. It came from resilience. Jax had built his power on fear, on control, on the suffering of others. But that had all been taken from him in the blink of an eye. And in its place, there was nothing but a hollow, gnawing emptiness. His empire had crumbled, his name now synonymous with failure and cowardice. And the worst part was the quiet realization that he had never truly been the one in control. He had believed his fearsome reputation would keep him safe, that his raw aggression could subdue any challenger. But against a man like Tyson, that bravado had meant nothing. Tyson had made him see the truth. He wasn't a king. He was a pawn. The real strength had never been in the power to destroy, but in the power to endure, to stand tall even when the world seemed against you. As the police finally arrived, their blue and red lights painting the alley in a surreal wash of color, Jax Carter, once a man who commanded terror and respect, was left with nothing but his shattered pride and the broken remains of his gang. His reputation, once feared across the district, now lay in ruins, the consequences of his hubris written clearly in the mess of bruises, blood, and broken bones around him. The cycle had come to an end. The consequences of his audacity had been swift and devastating. There was no turning back now. And somewhere, deep within, Jax understood. The man who had once ruled the streets had been dismantled, not by force, but by the weight of his own arrogance. The pain, both physical and psychological, would follow him for days, weeks, perhaps even years. But the humiliation, the knowledge of his utter defeat, would haunt him forever. It was a lesson in power, a lesson in pride, a lesson in what happens when you overestimate yourself and underestimate the world. And Jax Carter would never forget that lesson.